Thank you so much. It's an honour to be here in the Scottish Parliament with all of you at Globe. The stakes were high coming into this COP with so many bold hopes and assumptions and statements. This COP has been meant to be a number of things, including the COP that consigns coal power to history. The latest UN production gap report shows that governments' production plans and projects could lead to 240% more coal than will be consistent with a 1.5-degree world. It's not that this COP should be the one that consigns coal power to history. It must be. But that alone is not enough. Climate policy and agreements are complicated. But what's not complicated is that 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere today come from three products: oil, gas, and coal. The World Economic Forum has for years estimated the most likely and greatest threats to humanity. For years, of course, this was nuclear weapons. Now, climate change, the failure to mitigate climate change, biodiversity loss, water scarcity, are the greatest and some of the most likely threats to humanity. Today, these three products, oil, gas, and coal, on which we all still in part depend, are our weapons of mass destruction. And to date, the far majority of our policies only regulate the emissions of those products, and not the production. How can we plan for a just transition when we are not regulating the production of fossil fuels, when we have so far ignored to include in any negotiations and our laws who gets to produce and how much at this important time in history? We know we have a limited carbon budget. So are we simply allowing the markets to decide the fate of humanity? For decades, we've been regulating emissions, we've been setting targets, but behind our backs, the fossil fuel industry has been hard at work, growing production, and then locking in future emissions that we can't afford to burn. Building infrastructure today that is not for 1 year or 2 years. When we spend billions of dollars on a new pipeline, it is for 20 or 40 years. If we need those new pipelines that we're building today in 20 to 40 years, then we know many on the planet are not safe. And we haven't done our jobs. Today, the UN Production Gap Report notes that we are on track to produce 120% more fossil fuels in the next decade than we can ever burn if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. In fact, even if coal was phased out overnight, existing oil and gas projects alone would push us above 1.5 degrees. Existing projects alone. I will never forget the day that I searched the Paris Agreement, trying to find the words oil, gas, coal, fossil fuels. I have worked on climate policy for 20 years. I have advised multiple governments, and I didn't realize that the Paris Agreement doesn't even include the words oil, gas, coal, or fossil fuels. They don't appear once in the world's climate agreement. The fossil fuel industry has been successful in making itself invisible. I spent several years meeting with the CEOs of oil companies because I wanted to understand, what do these people see when they see this science? And because I truly believe that there are good people everywhere, but good people who are stuck in bad systems. What I found out is that they know. They know that the production will have to wind down along with the emissions, but every one of them is hoping that they will be the last barrel standing. And so are some of our countries. Or that unproven technologies like carbon capture and storage will allow them to continue to expand production. There is no question that we need carbon sequestration, both from nature and from technology, but not to justify the further expansion of fossil fuels. Because every ton of carbon right now that we save from putting in our atmosphere, we know will save lives. For decades, climate policy has been designed on a theory that our job is to legislate to reduce emissions, to deal with the demand side of the equation. That we will increase the price, that demand will go down, and then the markets will constrain supply. Even today, turbocharged by renewables that are now cheaper in most jurisdictions than fossil fuels, the markets are not constraining supply. It's not working. It's not working fast enough to keep us safe. Why not? In part because the markets are distorted with tax breaks and fossil fuel subsidies. I know that there are quibbles on the definitions now about fossil fuel subsidies, but the IMF report from a month ago should be a wake-up call to all of us. $11 million a minute in fossil fuel subsidies right now on this globe to the companies producing the products that we say we're moving away from. Here's the thing. Today, we are granting permits and pouring trillions of dollars right now into expanding production of the products that we say we're transitioning away from. It is not a transition if we continue to grow the problem. This year, the IEA and the IPCC both concluded that if we want to stay below 2 degrees, we must stop expanding fossil fuel production and emissions. The wind down must happen now, no new projects. So let's be clear, we already have enough fossil fuels. We already have enough fossil fuels either under construction or in the system for the world while we wind down to a cleaner and safer future. So how do we plan carefully for a phase-out? What kind of laws? What kind of agreements do we need to address production? How can we quickly deal with this gap in our theory of how to address climate change? Because right now, the world is spending its intellectual, its financial, and its technical capital to dig up stuff that we know we can't burn, or it will burn us. A year ago, a group of academics, scientists, lawyers, advocates, and former diplomats came together to launch the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative to create the missing framework for constraining the supply side of fossil fuels. First, stopping the expansion, and then carefully reducing production. Shockingly, what we found out is that there isn't even public accounting today or transparency on who's producing what and how much. There is no global registry of fossil fuel productions and reserves. So we're hard at work creating it. Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor will release a prototype later this week at COP26. We're also working to make sure the treaty is grounded in principles of equity. What's holding us back from constraining production is different in the developing and the developed world. Some countries today, like Ecuador, in the heart of the Amazon, are drilling for new oil just to feed their debt. Some countries are simply more exposed than others and will need support to end expansion. And that's why, if we simply leave what fossil fuels we produce to the markets, equity and justice will not be taken into account. We will have an unmanaged decline instead of a managed one, a boom and bust as projects are no longer funded, and more people will suffer. That's why, while divestment is critical, the financial commitments that we've heard at COP26 are absolutely critical. They are not enough. Government policy, laws, international agreements are critical because the markets will not do this alone. The wind down of oil, gas, and coal must happen around the globe through international cooperation, and the wealthy countries must act first. Legislators must get together and agree to the principle of no new production and set that as a global norm. and then begin the work of negotiating the drawdown of production over time in line with what's required by science. The good news is that in the less than a year since we announced the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, over 101 Nobel laureates, including the Dalai Lama, have endorsed the principles of the treaty. Over 2,500 academics from 81 countries have delivered a letter endorsing the principles of an international cooperation to wind down production at the UN General Assembly. Cities from around the world have begun to pass motions endorsing the treaty. Barcelona, Los Angeles, Vancouver, similar to nuclear non-proliferations when cities had to take a critical role. Over 800, 900 now, civil society organizations on every continent are now calling on their governments to negotiate a fossil fuel treaty to wind down production. The theme of COP26 Legislators Summit is accelerating climate action and delivering a green, fair, and resilient recovery. We know that a practical pathway exists where there are no new fossil fuel projects. Existing projects are phased out, emissions are kept within a 1.5-degree budget, and energy access becomes universal, all while using existing and increasingly cost-competitive technology. The hurdle, as we've heard here at the summit, is no longer economic nor technical. Our biggest challenges are us here in this room working together to make it happen. We can and should act now to regulate fossil fuel production decline, but the exciting news is many of you are. The 20 parliamentarians from the Global South, Malaysia, Philippines, Costa Rica, Rwanda, many other nations, have initiated a global sign-on call for new international commitments and treaties that would complement the Paris Agreement to stop expansion and wind down production. Their demands are now backed by over 150 parliamentarians from 25 nations, including many here in this room, including Senator Galvez and Caroline Lucas, who we heard from yesterday. We thank you for your leadership. This work is difficult. It's hard to see past the systems we have. It will take courage. But the incredible thing about courage is that courage is contagious. The more we act, the more other people will act. By stepping up, you will inspire other parliamentarians to take on these difficult issues, and together you can make enormous change. This Wednesday, the parliamentarian letter will be released and launched at COP26. I hope you will join them. I know that some of you are thinking a treaty is unfeasible. It's too big. It's going to take too long. That we don't have time to negotiate something new like this. The same was erroneously said about weapons treaties. I think the answer is that we don't have time for more of the same. A fossil fuel treaty will help us wind down fossil fuels. It's one of the key missing pieces in our fight against climate change. It will both complement and help us achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. It is a bold new idea, but at this moment in history, we need bold new ideas. Thank you.